Welcome, everyone. I want to take a dive into the confluence here between complex trauma, psychedelics, and animating the natural world. And I want to start out by talking a little bit about what I mean by complex trauma. And my training over the past few years has been at what now is the Complex Trauma Training Center. It's a NARM inspired training center. The NARM model, the neural affective relational model, which really focuses on these attachment patterns and the way that we learn to organize and relate to our internal experience based upon the environment or the environmental failure we experienced as a child. And often, what happens when the environment doesn't meet our needs, if there's a chronic pattern of our needs not being met, or if there's a kind of abuse or neglect, that we as children find ourselves in an impossible bind because we rely on the adults in our environment to survive, and we just don't have the capacity to leave and go get a job or to leave that environment. So we rely on these beings to survive. They actually become our universe, in which is all that we have as a child. And so if there is a kind of neglect or abuse or chronic misattunement, we're forced to have to adapt to this environment. And that often comes through a process of disconnecting from ourselves through shame. We also develop all other kind of adaptations to survive and navigate these environments, such as pressuring ourselves to meet some kind of external expectation, so that we may get a sense of belonging or connection. We often learn to please others or attempt to meet others' needs as a way to get our own needs met. And there's a variety of other ways that we might develop. You might be familiar with some of your own. And then how developmental trauma and complex trauma then forms is when we take those patterns into our adulthood. And we often struggle in three areas, and these are kind of the three areas of CPTSD. Is we struggle with regulating ourselves, we struggle in our interpersonal relationships, and we also develop a negative self-concept. Or in the work that I do, many people talk about their inner critics. And all of these patterning comes out of the environmental failure that we experienced as a child and how we had to learn to adapt to that failure. And often the process of beginning to heal our complex trauma, there's a few pieces of it. One is starting to understand and bring greater awareness to these unconscious patterns of the way that we have learned to organize ourselves or how we're relating to ourselves in the world. For example, if we often find ourselves pressuring ourselves to meet some kind of unrealistic expectation, often that's a pattern that comes out of this environmental failure where we had to learn to adapt. But it can also be pretty subtle and unconscious. So one of the processes of healing complex trauma is starting to understand, not only on a cognitive level, but like a deep felt sense of these patterns and the impact of what the environment had on us as a child, as a way then to shift into really the second piece, which is really one of the most biggest pieces, is to start to relate to ourselves with greater compassion, love, and understanding. It's like a reconnection to ourselves, a reconnection to our heart. And in that reconnection to our heart becomes a greater aliveness in which we can then bring more of ourselves, our authentic self, or our soul into the world. And so this, how then complex trauma then plays into psychedelics and psychedelic work or plant medicine work, in what I'm seeing, weaves in many, many different ways. And I'm going to share more about that in upcoming videos. I just wanted to start to lay the foundation to understanding complex trauma. And then I'm also going to talk about how complex trauma also is in relationship to animating the natural world, which, simply put, animating the natural world is beginning to live in an environment, in a world that's alive and ensouled. And that kind of way of living is going to be dependent on a greater connection to ourselves and a greater ability to connect through our body, our senses, and imagination to these alive and ensouled beings. And so, where complex trauma fits in, and I'll discuss more, is that when we are disconnected from ourselves through these patterns or these survival adaptations, we're not able to fully be in conversation. And the way that this starts to weave into psychedelics is that, in my opinion, and you've probably heard a lot about set and setting, coming in with a certain mindset into a kind of setting that supports our journey, is being in a deep conversation with the spirit or the consciousness of the medicine you're working with. And the more that we can come in deep, more connected to ourselves and deepening into that conversation and be open to being in that dialogue with this consciousness or the spirit of these medicines, the greater support we can have within our journey for our intention of either healing or connecting to something greater than yourself. So I'll kind of go deeper into this in our next video, where I'll talk more about complex trauma, psychedelics, and animating the natural world, and how you might begin to develop some sort of practices in your own life where you can start to deepen into not only greater connection, but the conversation with this live and ensouled wild world in which we live.